Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Classical Music Composition. Today we'll explore the so-called Rondo-Sonata or Sonata-Rondo, which is an expansion of the classical rondo form that we already discussed in depth in my previous video. As we already stated, a rondo is a musical form that consists on the alternation between a rondo theme or refrain, usually labeled as A, and a minimum of 2 episodes. We also talked about how, in a rondo, the refrain must always sound in the initial key either major or minor, while the episodes might be in a lot of different possible keys. However, there is a special preference for the dominant key, which is the 5th degree of the initial key, for the episode 1, when the initial key is in major mode, and the 3rd degree key when the initial key is in minor mode. This is an important detail that will have its relevance when dealing with the rondo-sonata form later. Features of the rondo-sonata. Generally speaking, rondo-sonata's characteristics can be sorted out in 2 different groups. Essential principles, which are to be regarded as indispensable with regard to this musical form, and recurrent features, which are present in many rondo-sonata examples, but that aren't actually mandatory. With regard to essential principles, we must keep in mind that the rondo-sonata is a hybrid that shares common features between the rondo and the sonata form. The first and most important rule of a rondo-sonata is that, no matter the total length or the number of episodes, the first episode must always reappear a second time, but now in the rondo's initial key. In this context, this first episode is to be regarded as the secondary theme of a sonata form, and its reappearance as the recapitulation. However, the fact that the first episode reappears a second time in the initial key doesn't automatically transform a rondo into a rondo-sonata. In order to do so, this first episode must be presented as a proper secondary theme, which leads us to the second essential principle. Some kind of transitional passage between the refrain and the first episode is necessary in order to link those sections together into a sonata exposition complex. The length and complexity of said transition is variable, but it usually follows a few basic principles that we'll discuss in more detail later. Just like in a sonata form, this transition can reappear in the analog spot of the recapitulation, either literal or varied. However, since now both sections share the same key, the recapitulatory transition allows for some more freedom in its treatment. Sometimes the composers will rewrite it, or even omit it altogether, depending on the musical context. With regard to non-essential features, one of the most common ones is the presence of a developmental middle episode. Just like in a sonata form, this developmental space represents a musical digression, a tonally unstable section in which new materials, or previously heard ones, can be elaborated through all kinds of different procedures, such as contrapuntal treatment or sequential modulations. In a rondo sonata, the length of this developmental space is variable. Sometimes it extends through all of the middle section, but other times it alternates with more stable materials that might resemble more of an actual rondo's episode. When this happens, we usually find a multi-module central section, in which we can distinguish 2 or more different parts. It's worth noting that the presence of a developmental space in a rondo sonata is by no means mandatory, as it isn't either for a proper sonata form. The second thing to keep in mind is that, just like in a sonata form, the recapitulation can start directly on the secondary theme, skipping the first part of the exposition. In the rondo-sonata context, this means that the reappearance of the refrain before the recapitulation of the first episode is considered optional, and many composers choose to simply skip it. Another recurrent feature of the rondo-sonata is the presence of retransitions, which are passages that connect the ending of every episode to the restatement of the refrain, as well as the addition of a final conclusive episode known as coda, both of which were already discussed in my previous video. As a final thought, it must be pointed out that there is no such thing as the perfect model for a rondo-sonata, as it lies somewhere in between 2 pre-existent musical forms, the rondo and the sonata, and most examples tend to lean more towards one side or the other in terms of character or complexity. Composing a rondo-sonata. My starting material for this sonata rondo will be an already composed rondo that I made from scratch in my previous video. Due to its total duration of more than 3 minutes, I'll refrain from replaying it here. However, I strongly suggest you pause the video at this point and check it out first, if you haven't already, so you can keep track of the changes. This was the formal layout of my rondo. A short rondo form with 2 episodes, the first in the 5th degree key and the second one in the flat 3rd degree key. It also included 2 transitions and 2 retransitions, as well as an ending coda. In accordance with the principles stated in this video, there is one big requirement missing, and that's the recapitulation of the first episode in the initial key. This is a pretty straightforward step, as in most of the cases the recapitulation of the secondary theme is a more or less literal transposition from one key to another. As we can see, this formal layout already matches the criteria for a rondo-sonata form, but we might want to make sure the transition between the refrain and the first episode qualifies as a valid sonata transition before proceeding forward. Although it's hard to give a universal definition of what a sonata transition should look like, there are certainly some common features observed in the classical repertoire that we should keep in mind. First, in fast movements, transitions tend to imply a forward motion, a dynamic impulse towards the next section, in this case the secondary theme area. Second, they may or may not modulate, but even if they don't, they normally include some degree of temporary tonic destabilization. Third, they usually end with a half cadential gesture either on the initial key dominant or on the secondary keys. If you aren't familiar with the concept of the half cadence and its use within the classical style, I recommend you watch my video on this specific topic, where I cover from the essentials to more advanced questions. Now, with all this in mind, let's check out our transition. In essence, this brief passage does everything that is expected from a sonata form transition, from the dynamic impulse forward to the half cadential ending. But there is yet a little detail to add that might get us even closer to a sonata feeling, and that's the medial caesura. A medial caesura is a brief musical rest inserted between the ending of the transition and the beginning of the next section. This optional feature is very recurrent within the sonata form and helps to make the distinction between sections even more explicit by literally cutting the exposition in two. Next, we have to decide what to do about the middle section of our rondo-sonata. Is it going to be a full developmental section, a plain tuneful rondo episode, or maybe a hybrid? In this case, I'll go for the latter option. A 2-part middle section which I'll name C1 and C2. For the second part, C2, I'll stick to the theme from my previously composed rondo, a tonally stable section in F major built as a small binary form. For C1, however, I'll compose a new brief developmental passage in C minor that'll work as a huge dramatic and tonal contrast. Notice that even if the whole passage begins and ends in C minor, arriving to its implicit dominant through an augmented 6th half cadential gesture, it's far from being tonally stable. The kind of modulating sequences displayed in this section, based on a same motivic content that moves from one key to another, is a very typical feature of developmental passages, and it's sometimes referred to by the German term Fortspannung.
Fortspinnung.
There is only one question left now, and that's how to deal with the recapitulation. As I explained earlier, there are plenty of options here, but this time I'll keep the refrain in its place, although going for a heavily variate version. Since I expect this variation to be dynamic enough, I'll get rid of the recapitulatory transition instead. Keep in mind that in musical forms that revolve around the concept of rotation or recapitulation, a big part of the interest lies in the way the composer brings back previously heard materials under a new light. These are the perfect moments for a creativity display on how to surprise your audience, and maybe adding some touch of humor. I won't tell you what kind of surprises I reserved for this part, but I'll let you hear them for yourself instead. I decided to arrange this piece as an orchestral work, suitable for a hypothetical final movement of an imaginary symphony that I'm naming Marlboro, like the title of the popular tune that I used for one of the episodes. This is all for today. Let me know if this video was helpful, and see you next time.